Speaking of an inconvenient time, Doc, let me welcome you into the show. How are you? We got some bad news this morning, but before we get to that, what's going on, man?
Well, we're kind of doing this on the fly in the sense that I just learned, in the last 10 minutes that the Taskmaster, Kevin Sullivan, has passed on to the next plane. Definitely, we're going to RIP here for him. You're the one that told me, so what do you know?
All I know is I woke up this morning and we literally recording this right after. This wasn't planned. We were gonna be recording today because we have a pay per view coming up and we got to get ahead on some things because Doc's soccer schedule, my schedule. So we were like, all right, let's get this done. That way we are on track and we will not be late because
And
we don't want to be late.
we get Harper in the
Yeah,
room for
we get
Super
we
Brawl.
yeah we get Harper in the room for Super Brawl and he watches it and all that good stuff. So I woke up, just jumped on Twitter like I do a lot of mornings just to see if there's anything popping for 2 minutes. And the first tweet I read is someone, I don't remember who, saying Kevin Sullivan's passed away. I'm like, no. I know he's been ill, but I'm thinking, okay, hold on. I need to hear this from somebody reputable. Because just a random person on Twitter saying RIP Kevin Sullivan is not reputable to me.
Sure.
I'm going to probably clip this for YouTube for anybody out there listening to this. That way it's more timely. And because this show won't drop for another week and a half on the main feed. And then I do some digging and I see our old friend, PWA insider Mike Johnson, who doesn't like this show because of a promo Harper cut on him. That was just Harper having fun. He blocked us years ago. But anyway, I did go to his website. And I got respect for Mike. He's reputable. He doesn't suck dongs just to
Whoa.
get a payday from AEW like some journalists do. But anyway, Mike Johnson reported it. I trust his reporting. I think he's very reputable. And then I saw James Beard, who has been on this show before and is a referee in the business. He refed in World Class many years ago after its heyday. He's been on this show several times if you want to look up in the archives and history of the show. And James posted this. Another sad morning for the wrestling fraternity. I woke up to hear my friend Kevin Sullivan has passed. To touch on everything Kevin contributed to professional wrestling would take a book. Boy, that's a mouthful. So true.
Mm-hmm.
From his days as a main event talent to his work behind the scenes as a creative mind, he was elite in every way. I'm blessed to have worked with him closely. And he not only was a dear friend, but a colleague I fully respected for his knowledge and skills. I treasure our time together, especially the private moments in person and on the phone. Kevin was talented, unique, and a special person. Godspeed, my friend. I think James is really good with words. Every time, unfortunately, someone in the wrestling business passes away, he's very good about the way he puts things together. And that pretty much says it all. I couldn't put it any better. What do you think? And
That's
what are
what
your
I,
thoughts on Sullivan passing away?
yeah, that's what I was thinking is, that's a really good tribute. And we could sit here and we're a little bit different in the regard. We're not going to sit here and go, well, in 1972, he got in the business and he went from here to here. Ours is more fan based in the sense that, what are your fond memories and what is your opinion? And there will be other podcasts you can go listen to for the blow by blow where people who are, interested in those kinds of things. I think James Beard did a great job there. I'm not, certainly not surprised given what we know about him. For me, Sullivan had a very lasting and enduring career in the sense that when I was a kid and I had a treasure trove of old PWIs and I would read them. There was nothing or no one that was more fascinating than what was going on in Florida in the early to mid 80s with what he was doing. It's just,
Yep.
it sounded like the most chaotic, insane thing that you could imagine. And the reason I say that is some of what I've heard Sullivan say on podcast about wrestling is, and it's I think it's true for his character, but it's also true today when you're telling a story or you're telling, even like a horror movie. And I think he used this analogy is less is more, and let the people fill in the gaps, because a lot of times what the people will fill in is way worse than anything we can come up with in the wrestling business or in like a horror movie. And so, and he also said, it's the anticipation of the event that's more important than the event itself in a lot of ways, although the event has to pay off. So in that sense, his stuff in Florida certainly qualifies there. Like, you're reading these magazines, I don't have a way to watch Florida, barely have a way to watch World Class. But you're like, oh my God, what could be happening down there? And the things I probably thought as a 10-year-old kid were worse than what was actually happening. But it was a wild ass scene. And then, he we're gonna laugh soon at the Dungeon of Doom, but who was Hogan gonna work with? And
Yeah.
and then he's been I've the audio withstanding, I enjoyed his podcast a lot of times because when he was in the mood to do it, he his thought process on wrestling is very insightful. He's somebody when you listen to, you're like, oh, I learned something by listening to his perspective on wrestling. That doesn't happen with everyone, you know?
Uh, yeah. I the I gained. I didn't know what I didn't know. I mean, I wasn't the dirt sheet reader that a lot of fans were. You weren't either. Harper wasn't. I'm glad I wasn't actually, because I think it skews your thought process if you
You're looking at
believe.
the business through a different lens when you're reading those kinds of things because you're looking for something different than what I'm looking for. I'm looking for holy shit moments. I'm looking for um personal issues. I'm looking for things that, you know, feel real in in a business that isn't, not angle execution. I mean, we talk about that stuff, but when I'm sitting watching, you know, WrestleMania or SummerSlam or whatever, I'm looking for something that was like, damn, that was unexpected, or damn, that made me feel something besides, oh, this is phony wrestling.
Well, where I was going with the dirt sheet thing was not being a dirt sheet reader has its benefits, because when I started listening to Kevin Sullivan's pod years and years ago, when he was on MLW radio, where this sound drop comes from.
It ain't that fucking hard, guys. We ain't building a rocket. We're getting guys over in a fake fucking business.
Every ever since I started playing that sound drop, I get tons of messages. Where's that from? Guide me to it. I don't remember the show. I could tell you it was probably around 2015 when he was on MLW radio with MSL.
That seems like a lifetime ago, Mike.
It was. And the context of that discussion, I do remember. They were at the time talking about how bad Roman and Kevin Sullivan had enough. And he just is like, it ain't that fucking hard, guys. They ain't building a rocket. We're getting guys over in a fake fucking business. And then right after that soundbite, he goes, Bruno would have been flipping Italian sausages if they'd have booked him like this. So
right.
I point this out because I, like you, was the, Pro Wrestling Illustrated reader and saw like his whatever Army of Darkness pictures from CWF in Florida and
Right.
with Mark Lewin and Luna, and then I'd see the photos of him with R.I.P. Nancy, with his then, I don't know if they were married at that point, on the beach, and they look like they were in a cult, and I'm like, holy shit, this guy looks real. And so I had that like perspective of Sullivan, and I think he was so good even for years. People thought the man was like in the devil worshiping when he wasn't. But so my perspective was that. But then when I started hearing him on pods, I was like, this dude is brilliant. Like when you listen to him talk about the current product, when he talked about how bad Roman was being booked at that time, and boy, have things changed. And then when he would talk about, him and MSL would go through the Nitro stuff, and they do really quick stuff. It wouldn't be like a long review. They would discuss like why things were done on certain Nitros, what the reason was that he would be. It was the North Tower. They wanted to impress the suits. Like when you listen to him, it wasn't Kevin Sullivan the performer. It was Kevin Sullivan going through rationally what the mindset was of the time, why they did what they did in WCW, what the problems were, why they couldn't do certain things. He was brilliant on those old shows. The audio on those shows were better than the more recent audio. No shot at John Paz, who he was doing a show with, because I like Paz a lot. It wasn't. I'm not going to blame him. Sullivan was the problem with the audio, not necessarily Paz. But anyway, Kevin Sullivan was brilliant. Like he was so. When you finally would listen to him, I really think the thought process he had on how he wanted to book things, the obstacles he had to face, why he couldn't do things a certain way. He didn't lay it out as an excuse. He just was like, look, this is how it was. Now, I'm not making an excuse, but this is how it was. This is why we couldn't do certain things in WCW. These are the obstacles I had to deal with. We all had to deal with. And I just thought he came across as a human being, not like you hear some people on podcasts, they become a personality. That wasn't him, even though you swore up and down he was getting a blowjob one time on a show. This is BTT. We got to be unprofessional in some way.
And I'm not saying that in a bad way.
No, right. But Kevin Sullivan was brilliant. He was so brilliant, so smart, so intelligent when it came to wrestling. And I know he's been ill. I think this has been going on since May.
So let's stop there. He was at an event in Florida, and there was some sort of car accident, and he's been real, like, when I went back and just looked at it this morning, because like, look, I don't keep up with everything because we have a hard enough time getting this show recorded.
Oh God, yeah.
I'm not sitting here like, oh, woe is me, but like, I don't have the free time to I wish. Not, and so sitting and scrolling and getting to read is a luxury a lot of times. So he's been ill for a while, and I guess I didn't realize this. I've also not had time to keep up with pods, so I haven't listened to his podcast in quite some time. I haven't listened to a lot of podcasts in quite some time. That's, my bad. I usually get Dutch and maybe some Corny. That's really about it these days. But he had been like encephalitis. I mean, that's brain inflammation. That's sepsis. Sepsis for a guy at his age. I mean, these things are no joke. Sepsis is no joke at our age.
Yeah. The accident, well, it says on his GoFundMe, which is shut. It's not shut down, but it's not taking donations, obviously, at this point. On May 12th, 2024, while in Florida for autograph signings, Nicole Sullivan posted, I think that's his daughter, Kevin suffered a devastating accident. He underwent emergency surgery that saved his leg and life, but faced severe complications, including, like you said, sepsis and encephalitis. This unforeseen catastrophe has placed an immense financial burden on his family, as Kevin has been in and out of consciousness in the ICU far from home. It goes on to talk about the challenges and more on his background with his career and working with Eddie Graham and all that good stuff.
That's the thing, is that guy worked. Let's do a little career retro here, and certainly those illnesses are no joke. And so,
she's got a write up about that. You want me to read it? Just real quick. It's like a paragraph.
I was just going to say no, because I've got some things I've heard from him. He was up in the Northeast, and he talks about how he saw Daddy McMahon's booking book, and was like blown away by the long-term thinking and the depth that it went into. And those are kinds of formative moments that shaped his thinking on the wrestling business. I've heard him talk about being down in Florida with Eddie Graham at the Sportatorium, and the things he was told to do to guys that were brought in there, and not being, looking back on it, not in fondness, but kind of ashamed of what he did. But, what was I supposed to do? I was a young guy who wanted to keep my job.
Mm-hmm.
And being a part of that and learning from Eddie Graham and being friends with Mike Graham, and just there's that. And then, you start getting into like what we've already discussed, which was, if you're our age and you were following wrestling in the 80s on a national level any way that you could back then,
Mm-hmm.
that was an indelible impression. But then, it's goofy, but you have the Dungeon of Doom. But you also have that shit between him and Benoit. It was brutal.
Wild. That shit was
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah, which, you can get into all that. And he just had he's one of those guys that, when we lose guys like that, you lose that touch point to the past, that lineage that is tied to a McMahon Sr., an Eddie Graham, a Dusty, those guys who really shaped the business the golden era. And I'd say, there's a couple of guys that you and I, if we were stupid enough and had money to burn, that we wanted to start a wrestling fed, and it's like, okay, well, you could have a booking committee, which you could laugh, but, you and I are getting on the horn with Corny and Sullivan immediately.
Oh yeah. Most definitely.
And so for that, it's like, I feel, first of all, I enjoy listening to the guy talk, because you might get a 1990s baseball tangent with the Red Sox for Dustin Pedroia, or John L. Sullivan early 1900s boxing lesson, or a history lesson. But that guy, and some of that's we think it's kind of goofy, and you kind of chuckled, but that means he's drawing on different things to inform his booking philosophy, which I think is interesting. So for me, I knew he was sick. I'm sad to hear that he didn't kick out, for sure. And he's one of those guys that we're all going to miss, because of the intelligence and the depth of thinking that he brought to this fake fucking business.
If you remember, Vice did the Benoit episode, right? And at the end, they said Kevin Sullivan declined to be a part of it. Go listen to when he was on with Cornette. It's probably on YouTube. They went probably 2 hours. Maybe I'm misremembering the time, but they went a long time where they walked through all of not only what was covered on the Vice episode, but just in general, the timeline of things. Kevin Sullivan comes across as much of a decent human being on that as, in my opinion, you can come across as. Just talking through that whole timeline, I say process, but timeline of events. I think that was the episode where they may have even talked about when they were booked in an angle together, him and Benoit. Can't remember specifically. I know I've heard it talked about elsewhere. You talked about that. That was some crazy stuff in WCW, which we'll get to at some point, hopefully. But I just think he had a brilliant mind for not only wrestling, because you're right. He would start talking about boxing history on his old pod, with the MS on MLW radio. And then he would get into baseball.
Yeah.
I know he was a big baseball guy, obviously. There was an episode where he's breaking down the burning of the library in Alexandria. And I can't do his voice, but he's like, just think of all the secrets that went up in flames. I mean, he was just, I'm laughing because he just had a wide range of things that he would talk about that you wouldn't have known that unless you listened to him not talk about wrestling. But he mixed that into his wrestling pods, obviously, to come up with examples or anecdotes and things that he would see in wrestling. I think he had a brilliant mind for professional wrestling. He did so much behind the scenes. I don't think he'll get credit for a lot of stuff he did behind the scenes as a booker in many instances. I mean, we're doing it here, and people who know do it.
One of the things that in that credit is that I think, and I'm glad to hear this, that Bischoff had some statements, but then started thinking about it and saying, how much Kevin Sullivan did, and they met at an event, and Sullivan was like, "Hey, can we talk?" And they buried whatever beef they had. So I'm glad to hear that, and I think Bischoff puts over Sullivan quite a bit as for his acumen on his shows, I think, and if so, that I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, because I think Bischoff at one point was pretty critical of him and maybe walked it back, and that's just one of those things where if you get in the same room with somebody and y'all can actually talk things through, not flame each other on Twitter and the internet like most people on the internet like to do because they think they're one-upping somebody, brother. Just have the time when you just have a conversation with another human being. You maybe can find some middle ground. I'm just saying.
I say this all the time. Man, I see all this. You flip on these news channels and all, even sports, man. All these things, and they're whipping you up into all this. Man, I'm a dude that lives in the suburbs with kids, and we have you'll sit in the backyard with somebody, and there's an acknowledgement that you're on the different side of the aisle from them, but I guarantee there's no let's start a civil war. Let's stop talking. It's like
I'm not for no civil war, dude. I like my sports and wrestling too much.
We basically disagree on a few social issues, and we kind of disagree on how our taxes are being spent.
Not in Texas. Everybody hates property taxes, whether you're blue or red or independent.
That's true too. But most of us are just trying to get to work, keep a job, pay the bills, raise your kids, have a little fun, and get to the end of the day. And so that makes me glad that and it's not about us, but it makes me glad when I heard that those two got on good footing, because there's no doubt in my mind that Sullivan and Bischoff worked together closely with others to really put Nitro where it was. And there's enough credit in that for everybody to get theirs.
But and to be fair to Bischoff, I mean, they all had handcuffs on them as they got into the Time Warner deal.
I'm not going to admit that.
I think they did. I mean, like, that's
But
why I hate that whole
that ties
discussion
me
about
up for not being able to blame him 7 years from now.
right. I mean, but that's that
7.
whole that's the whole who killed WCW thing that drives me up a wall. But anyway, not on that. Kevin Sullivan, obviously, during my wrestling fandom, I'm still a fan, but during my early fandom years, obviously wasn't somebody I was like, oh yeah, I love him, he's great. But the appreciation after the fact for him is immense. The Smoky Mountain years, when Nancy's feeding him the grapes, you can't see her face because they can't show on camera, and he's cutting these weird promos. Even in on Saturday night, remember he was talking about the Buddha Dean and the lady in the third eye. I mean, it's just insane shit. Like he was.
What do you think they do to monkeys in Malaysia?
What do you think they do to monkeys in Malaysia? Kevin, I just immense respect. I think he is one of the brilliant minds in pro wrestling history, especially our era and eras. And he was 74. That's too young as I get older. It's way too young. And it's unfortunate, but the good news is in the day and age of podcasting, he's done tons of shows. He's on numerous episodes of audio on various pods. I know he was on 605 numerous times. He was on Cornette that one big time. Well, he's been on Cornette more than once, I believe. He had his own show. He had multiple versions of his own show. I just think it's great that we live in an era where those stories are in audio form, where people can search them out and listen. Because they're, when you think of the guys from the earlier days of wrestling who passed before then, I would have loved to have, listen to some JYD and talk about the stuff that Sullivan talked about. So not that they would talk about the same stuff, but people who passed before the day and age of the podcast and shoot interviews became a real big thing. So I think we're lucky and fortunate for that, but just RIP Kevin Sullivan, gone way too soon. I don't care if he was 74. He's still gone too soon, in my opinion. Doc, any closing thoughts or anything else you want to mention?
I think you said it well. He is somebody who's always been a favorite of ours for multiple reasons that we've outlined. The wrestling world is worse for this. And again, RIP, and we'll move on to the next thing.
Yeah, so there's really no easy transition, and appreciate you listening to this if you're on YouTube. I think we're going to get to the main part of our show now, which is covering. Let me share my screen first, Doc, with you. That way you have it, and I'll get the video version going. But yeah, if you're just watching the video version or not catching the clip that we did on YouTube, we just did RIP Kevin Sullivan. Did you have anything else, Doc, before we, again, it's hard to move on from a topic like that. Anything else before we jump into February 6th of 1993?
Like you said, we just got done recording a couple of days ago, so I don't really have a lot. So I'm actually ready to talk about some classic wrestling. You said what, February 6th?